Hey everyone, Lize here. This is my 31st birthday, and in honor of my birthday, yes, thank you Kat, in honor of my birthday I decided that I want to do a list of the 31 books that have stuck with me in these past 31 years. Obviously I don't intend to make it like one book per year, as in physically like a book for my first year, a book for my second year, because the first couple of years would be very boring, actually quite long for me, because I wasn't like an avid reader until the age of 12 or something like that, so it would mean that the first 12 years of my life would have been like super boring, and I don't want to be wasting 12 books to 12 books out of the 31 for this video to books that I didn't thoroughly enjoy. So I've got all the books with me that I physically own, so I think it's about 16 out of the 31 that I physically own. So I've also got a list on my cell phone because otherwise I just run too much risk of forgetting about some. So I'm just going to go in that order. So the first one on the list is basically a book that's no surprise to me or to anybody who actually knows me personally, but it is going to be a surprise to others because it's a book that's still not known in the English-speaking language. It's originally published in Dutch, my native language, and it's one of the books that I widely consider to be my the books that got me started reading, and that is The King of Katoren. I think it is To Be a King in English actually. But Koning van Katoren by Terlouw is the book that got me started. It is the first introduction for me into the fantasy genre. So in this book our main character is set out on a test of trials, and if he succeeds in these trials then he will become the king of this kingdom. Absolutely loved this as a child. It's one of the books that got me reading, so it definitely needed to be mentioned here. So the second book on my list is actually the second book that I would also consider to be a huge impact to me starting reading, or me starting to read a lot more than I did when I was a young child. And that is Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. I've just lent out my English edition, so I only have my Spanish one here. It is due for a reread. It is on my 2019 TBR, so I will hopefully be rereading it somewhere this year. So Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, we all know the story. Harry Potter is a young orphan boy living with his aunt and uncle who are treating him horribly until one day he finds out he's a wizard and is sent off to wizarding school in Hogwarts. This is my favorite installment in the series. It's the only one that made me cry. And yeah, I just love it so much. So I'm very much of the Harry Potter generation, so this has definitely been a huge staple in my reading life. So third book is also a book that is very prominent, that was very prominent for me in my teenage years. I wouldn't necessarily, it's not one of the books that got me started reading, but it's definitely one that I've been enjoying throughout my teenage years, so I wanted to mention here. This is the Dutch version, but it exists in English. This is Cirque du Freak by Darren Shan. This is a vampire series, but it's very different from most vampire series because it totally does not focus on romance or anything like that. Our main protagonist in this story is also called Darren Shan also as well, and he, along with a friend of his, is kind of like sneaking into the sort of like giant freak show that is visiting his neighborhood, and the friend who he's going with is very much obsessed with one of the people who they see during this performance, and it turns out that that person is actually a vampire. To his astonishment, Darren Shan's friend is actually trying to become a vampire, and the story and the series will unroll further from there. I really enjoyed it. I don't know whether it would hold up if I reread it. I've reread it multiple times when I was a teenager, but I thoroughly enjoy it, and would definitely recommend for younger audiences, and definitely recommend you check it out if you like vampires and you want a different take on the vampire storyline. Fourth book on the list is actually a book that I did not rate 5 stars, but I think in hindsight that that's a huge problem. I should actually reread it to see whether it was indeed a 4-star or whether I should have given it a 5-star, but it is one of the books that I really recommend to people and that I really remember as being incredibly good, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Don't know too much about it anymore. I know that like our protagonist in this story is like marrying a widower, and that she constantly feels overshadowed by his widow, and this widow sort of takes on like she becomes like an extra presence more or less in the house in which she's moving into, and actually also like everybody around her keeps comparing her to, you know, the previous wife of this new husband of hers. I really enjoyed it. I also thoroughly enjoyed My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier, but I just remember really liking Rebecca, and even though I can't remember too much about the plotline now, and it's definitely due for a reread. I prefer to take Rebecca over my cousin Rachel because of that. So the next one I do have in a bind-up, so I cannot show you guys separately, though I want to get separate versions of all of these books because it's super annoying to read them in this bind-up, and that is Persuasion by Jane Austen. So I have the full bind-up of all of her novels. It's a close call between Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion for me, but I guess I choose Persuasion because it's like the less obvious choice, I guess, and a lot of people have read Pride and Prejudice and not a lot have read Persuasion. I thoroughly enjoy Persuasion. In Persuasion we follow Anne Elliot, who's just kind of reaching like the age of spinsterhood, and she had this one romance in her lifetime with Captain Wentworth, but his status was below expectation, so her family and her best friend encouraged her not to agree to his proposal of marriage. But we are now so many years later, and Captain Wentworth enters back into their lives, but he has grown up in status. He's a captain now. He's very much regarded as being a prominent figure and an eligible bachelor, an eligible bachelor, but of course he is very much burned by her rejection, and so we follow the development of their relationship further in this book. I very much enjoyed it and absolutely recommend it. It is, together with Pride and Prejudice, my favorite Jane Austen. Next up is a very different genre. In the end I didn't decide to take too many books from this genre, just because yeah, I find it difficult to find like, I only wanted to recommend my absolute favorites in this genre, so I came up with a little bit less, and I also didn't want to repeat authors, so every single book on this list will be by a different author. And so for this one I chose The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. This is a recent one for me because I read it last year and I absolutely enjoyed it. It's a close call for me between The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance, its sequel, and of course the Mistborn trilogy, but I do think The Way of Kings and the whole Stormlight Archive is on a higher scale still than the Mistborn, and when it is eventually concluded it will definitely be seen as his masterwork. The Way of Kings has a very complex storyline. Basically we are entering into a world in which there used to be these sort of like guardian protectors of the realm called the Night Regents, and they were kind of standing in between like humankind and a threat that it's not entirely clarified what the threat exactly is, except that they are named the Voidbringers. But at some point they decide to step away from the battle and to leave mankind to its fate. And in this book we are kind of following 4 different characters who are navigating this new world, who are navigating different positions. So we have a general in an army, we have a girl venturing out to seek an education and to kind of find a solution for some home situations, and we have like a soldier who has kind of fallen on bad terms because of a betrayal that has happened in his past by one of his commanders, and so we follow different characters along as they navigate this world. But it's very complex. You cannot really convey the story correctly, but just try it. It's wonderful. It's really brilliant, absolutely brilliant. On to a totally different recommendation, and it is If on a Winter's Night, A Traveler by Italo Calvino. If on a Winter's Night, A Traveler is bizarre. I mean, it's weird literature, it's bizarre with literature. I wouldn't be able to give you a plot for this at all, but it's frequently plays with breaching the fourth wall between, so with the author addressing the reader or the author introducing the reader into its story, and I absolutely love meta in stories, and so I absolutely love this as well. I would say it's probably somewhat like magical realism, but it's been too long for me to remember, but I absolutely enjoyed it, and I definitely want to read more Italo Calvino. Next one I actually forgot to take out of my bookshelves. Where is it? Okay, one second. Alright, so the next one is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfus. Second book did not live up to the level where this one got, but it is frequently considered a masterpiece of fantasy writing. In this story we have a narrator who goes to a certain pub to seek out a certain legendary figure called Kavote. Kvothe is introduced in the back as like, I have stolen princesses back from sleeping barrow kings, I have burned down the town of Trebon, I have spent the night with Valurian and left with both my sanity and my life. I was expelled from the university at a younger age than most people are allowed in. I tread paths by moonlight that others fear to speak of during day. I have talked to gods, loved women, and written songs that make the minstrels weep. So basically this is a very legendary figure who will tell his story over the course of 3 nights, and every book is one of those nights. I preferred the first one so far, and the third one still needs to come out, but there are rumors that it is coming out in 2020, which means I need to reread definitely the second one. I remember the first one very well, but I do think I will also reread the first one, but the series is definitely due for a reread because I don't remember anything that happened in the second one. So yeah, first one is wonderful, second one doesn't live up so far. Next one is a book that I thought I owned physically, but that I just cannot find. Should be there, but I don't think I own it then in that case apparently. And that is The 5 People You Meet in Heaven by Mitch Albom. Title is basically explanation of the story. It is somebody who is going to heaven, and then in heaven he meets 5 people who have made a staple on his life, or on whose life he has made a staple that I don't remember anymore. It's very much of a different tone than most of the books that I've mentioned so far, so it's very much more like a heartwarming, cozy read than it is something hard-hitting. Next one is one that I don't own and I don't know too much about anymore. It's a very short read as well, and that is Animal Farm by George Orwell. It's basically a story that it's basically a reflection of our society, but the story is told through animals. And I think it's something about like a sort of a riot against the farmers who are controlling the lives of these animals, but I'm not entirely sure anymore. But yeah, when I go into a classic, I'm sometimes expecting it to be more of a dry read for me, and in this case I was also somewhat expecting that, just because political isn't always my thing, but I really enjoyed this allegory. Is it an allegory? I keep on forgetting the way you call it when you use animals to portray human problems and human emotions, but whatever that word is, please put it in the comments. That's what this story is. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I definitely think if you want to try more classics, it's a good one because it's relatively short, and I definitely think it's accessible to most people. Next we come to a very recent one, namely one that I finished in May, and that is The Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki and His Years of Pilgrimage by Haruki Murakami. In this we follow Tsukuru Tazaki, who in high school was part of a very close-knit group of friends who all had colors in their names, and then he was basically referred to as the Colorless Tsukuru Tazaki because his name does not refer to color. And he starts to see himself also that way, as being the colorless one of the group, you know, being the one who doesn't really add anything to the group, being the one who's just kind of tagging along. And it's when his group one day decide that he's no longer welcome in that group, it definitely hits him hard. He goes through a very dark phase in his life. But so many years later, he's encouraged to seek out answers, to find out why this group ousted him from their midst. And so it's a very small story in a way, because it doesn't really have the big scales or anything like that, but I absolutely adored this. And surprisingly, I would at this point consider it to be my favorite Murakami. Next we have a book that I do not own. This is Mouse by Art Spiegelman. It is a graphic novel about I think the Second World War, could be confused, could be the First World War. And basically it is the same as Animal Farm. It's a story represented through animals, because in this case the mice are like the Jews, and then the Germans are like the cats in the story. I thought it was very moving and very nicely executed. So I definitely think it's a staple of World War related literature, and it's definitely something different than your usual World War literature, so I definitely think it's a recommendation for people who like reading in that genre. I don't remember too much about it as always, because it's been too long ago. I just remember it being absolutely beautiful. That brings us to like the third book that I consider to be one of the books that got me into reading, which is Brief voor de Koning by Tonke Dragt. I think this only exists in the Dutch language, so sorry for you English readers. This is basically sort of like adventure story with knights in it, and the boy that we are following, Turi, he is kind of going through the last phase before becoming a full knight. So if he spends, so he needs to go through a wake in which he's not allowed to leave the chapel in which he's performing it, and he is not allowed to say a word or anything like that. But when he hears the desperate cries of a certain man outside, he decides to break this wake and to step outside, thus forgoing his knighthood, but also thus starting on a grand adventure to deliver a letter to the king on the other side of the mountains. Absolutely love this book, reread it recently. I don't know whether it's just my nostalgia for it, but I still think it holds up. So continuing with another Dutch book, this one is translated into English. It's very much a controversial book, as in even in Belgium as well, like people either hate it or they like it. And a lot of people are saying it's overrated. To me, it was, I mean, I absolutely adored it, but there are good reasons for me to like it as well, because, so I'm talking about It Melts by Lize Spitz. Lize Spitz is the same age of me, and so a lot of things that she refers to in this book when she's talking about, so it's a book about childhood mostly, and so a lot of the things that she refers to are so vivid to me. There's so much part of my childhood, though there's a lot of weird stuff happening here that definitely wasn't part of my childhood, but in any case there are definitely things that refer back to my childhood that are so recognizable to me that I absolutely adore this novel. I very much like where it's going to, but I know that the ending is a part of the book that's most controversial. So if you want a sliver of like the Flemish countryside of like Flemish small town living, then It Melts by Lize Spitz could be a good introduction to you to this sort of literature. I have seen reviews by people who are not Dutch about it, and it seems to be a very controversial book in every single language. So there are people who are not Flemish who absolutely love it. There are people who don't really understand what all the fuss is about. But so I absolutely adored it, would still recommend it. It's a very different story than a lot of other stories out there. I would still give it that. Next is another childhood read, and that is The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende. This is a German originally I think it's originally a German language book. I absolutely love it. It's just super fantastical, and that is very much the reason why I chose it. I mean, I don't think that as an adult it's as enjoyable as when you are a child, but it definitely brings me back to my childhood whenever I read it, and so it could be a good recommendation for a niece, nephew, child, or anything like that. The story is set in like two different places. So first of all, you have the red font. The red font is like the present day, and we are following a boy called Alexander who has who's a bit overweight, and he's being chased down the streets by one of his classmates when he goes in hiding in a sort of bookstore and stumbles upon a book called The Never-Ending Story. He accidentally shoplifts the book away from the store, and when he's reading it, he gets totally sucked in, quite literally, because it becomes part of the story, which is the blue text. Absolutely loved it. There's a movie about it, but the movie is very much like super 90s style with super bad visuals and things like that, so I would recommend the book instead. Next up is another book that I do not own, and that is We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver. By Lionel Shriver, I don't know how to pronounce it, my apologies. So We Need to Talk About Kevin is a very dark book. I won't give too much away because the ending is basically part of the, I think it is part of the surprise. I'm confused now because there's also a movie, and in one of the two you know from the beginning what's going to happen, and in the other one you don't, and now I've completely forgotten which one is which, but so I won't spoil too much. But it's basically about a mother who finds herself to be less than infatuated with her son. She's basically sees her son as being somewhat like evil or something like that. She's very much not seeing the good in her son and the evolution in their relationship, also in the relationship between her and her husband, because her husband sees her as a bad mother because of this, and later revelations of what takes place within this family life. I thought it's super dark, but it's also very much gripping, and the twist at the end was really like heart-wrenching, so I had to include it here because it's one of the books that emotionally touched me the most, I guess. Next we have a book of which I have the Dutch version here, but exists in English. It is originally Portuguese, and that is Blindness by José Saramago. I absolutely love this book. I had to read it in I had to read it in high school, which is usually a staple for me not liking a book, because when I'm forced to read a book, I tend to be grudgy about it apparently. But Blindness was the exception. So in Blindness we follow a society in which people from one day to the next start becoming blind. And so it starts very sporadically, like one person that day, another one maybe a couple of days later, and so we follow one of the early cases. So we follow the wife of one of the earliest cases, and so her husband goes blind from one day to the other, and she decides to pretend to be blind as well, just so that she gets taken away with him, because the police show up and immediately want to take him away. And so through her eyes we see the story unfold. So he is taken to like a secret facility in which people, all sort of people who have gone blind, have been taken into, and she kind of sees how this, and through her eyes we see kind of what's going wrong in that institution, because people from the outside are afraid to go in case that blindness can be contagious or anything like that. So basically there's like no structure or no authority inside, and so an authority is quickly established, basically even by a group that is led by a person who was actually already blind and who isn't as impaired by the blindness as people are who have just gone blind. And so I really enjoyed this. If you've seen the movie, the book is way more, it goes into way more things. It is definitely also trigger warnings for any type of violence, sexual violence included. This is quickly turning into the longest video I've ever made, because this is already, I think, like the fourth time I have to go and restart my camera, because it only films in like 10 minutes increments. So we have gone on from Blindness to another book from my high school days that I absolutely enjoyed, which is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. I do not remember anything about this story. I definitely need to reread it, but I remember really being impressed by it, and I consider it, along with Blindness, to be one of the books that kind of gave me a nudge towards like adult fiction, to adult literary fiction, which is one of the two genres that I now mainly enjoy, fantasy and literary fiction. Next up we have a book that I had to read in university, and that is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Never Let Me Go is a book in which we follow sort of like a board school setting in the UK, but it's a very different board school because the students in it turn out to be clones. It's not a spoiler, it's mentioned relatively soon at the beginning of the book, and so it's very much about what does it mean to be human, and the ethics of basically creating these clones just so that their organs could be harvested at some point or another when the originals need them. I very much like this, and as with all of these books, I definitely want to reread it at some point. On to the only book from our book club that I want to put on it, and that is Stoner by John Williams. It is very much a book set in a university setting, so we are following a university professor, and I don't know too much about it anymore actually. I just know that I really love the story. I think that just like Colorless, Tsukuru, Tazaki, this is a story that stays very small, that stays very much on the individual, that doesn't have high stakes or anything, that's very much more of a character piece. But I absolutely love these types of stories when executed well, and both in Murakami's case and John Williams' case, I believe he did a wonderful job with it, so I highly recommend. Next up is a staple of American literature, so for all of you from the US watching this video, you will have probably read this in high school, and that is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I really loved this book when I finally read it. So in To Kill a Mockingbird we see kind of the story of a courtroom case against a black man through the eyes of the daughter of the white lawyer who is defending this guy. And it's very interesting to see it through her eyes, because she's very much blind to racial discrimination, or at least so I remember it to be that case, that she doesn't really see how it is possible that all of these people cannot understand that this guy is innocent, but of course she will also assume the guy to be innocent because her father is defending him. But I really enjoyed it, and I must say I've read the sequel as well, and that was a big disappointment. So if you've read To Kill a Mockingbird, don't go into Ghost at a Watchman. Just keep To Kill a Mockingbird in your mind as the final book, because I absolutely adored this, and Ghost at a Watchman really wasn't good. But so yeah, I absolutely love this, highly recommend. It is a staple of American literature for a reason. Next we come to somewhat of an odd one out in this list, but definitely not in my experience of the book, and that is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. I absolutely adore Jurassic Park. I like a lot of Michael Crichton's work, but I do believe Jurassic Park is the strongest of the books that I've read so far. If you've seen the movie, don't think that you don't need to read the book, because the book, I mean, I had seen the movie before before I read the book, and the book definitely expands upon it definitely expands upon the movie even more. I definitely think that they are equally as enjoyable. I might have enjoyed the book a little bit more just because it has sort of like structure to it that makes it kind of enjoyable. It's basically structured around the chaos theory that Dr. Malcolm also explains in the movie, but so here the chapters are really like organized around this chaos theory that was touched upon in the movie, and that adds a level to the book that I don't think is in there in the movies. And so but I absolutely enjoyed this and would definitely recommend. Next up is a book that I read in university and that I don't remember too much about, but I remember thoroughly enjoying, and it being quite of a surprise for me as well, because it's a classic, but I never heard of this author or this book at all, and that is Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser. So this is a staple of American literature as well. So Theodore Dreiser was a writer in I have problems with centuries. So basically in the 19th century, well, basically in the transition from the 19th to the 20th century, and his book was very much controversial at time of its publication, because it's about a country girl who kind of rises in position when she becomes the mistress of a very important and wealthy man. And so this is a subject that clearly was very much controversial in the time. It was then published in a very redacted version, and this is the restored version, and I remember really liking it. It's very much also reminded me of like a Dickens piece, a Dickensian novel, which I also like a lot. So I don't remember too much about it because it's been so long. I basically read this about 10 years ago at this point, but I would definitely give it a go. If you like classics, if you like Dickens, this is definitely a less obvious choice that I would highly recommend. Another book that I actually own that is not with me at the moment, or what? I see it. Ugh. Smooth. So the next one is His Bloody Project by Graham McRae Burnett. This was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2016, and I read it back then. I really wanted it to win. In all fairness, I hadn't read the other books in the shortlist, but I really enjoyed this, which was also somewhat to my surprise, because it's basically we are relating a crime that happened in Scotland, and we are kind of going through the proof related to that crime. I'm very much not a crime reader or a detective reader or anything of the kind, but this one for some reason really struck me